Hi, so the Trump administration's foreign aggression is not currently limited to Iran. So today I'll cover what else it's been doing on the international stage. And then I'll go to the US and look at how the US's white nationalist agenda has also been growing. And then kind of end on looking at some important actions undermining the rule of law, democracy, and science, all of which have happened over the last week. So starting with foreign aggression. Firstly, Trump's been talking about withdrawing troops and has been withdrawing troops. So he threatened to withdraw US troops from Italy and Spain a day after he threatened to do it from Germany. He was asked, would you do it? And he said, yes, look, why shouldn't I? Italy has not been any help to us and Spain has been horrible, absolutely horrible. As a reminder, these are all NATO allies. The same day, the Pentagon announced that the US was going ahead and withdrawing 5,000 troops from Germany. And this is really considered to be a retaliation against Germany's Chancellor Merz, who said in an interview that the US had been humiliated by Iran. And then the next day, Trump said he would go further. And he said, we're going to cut way down and we're cutting a lot further than 5,000. The Trump administration has also been threatening Europe more generally. Firstly, in its new counter-terrorism strategy, the Trump administration accused Europe of being an incubator for terrorism fueled by mass migration. It says its strategy is focused on rooting out violent left-wing extremists, including radically pro-transgender groups. And basically, this is a way of trying to impose the kind of white nationalist agenda from the US onto Europe. Trump then also threatened the EU, saying that if it doesn't comply with its end of the trade deal by the 4th of July, he'll significantly raise tariffs again. On to other international organisations, Trump officials basically threatened the UN budget and said, we're going to cut the funding the US gives you unless you agree to our trade over aid agenda. So basically, that's the US trying to use budget cuts to leverage influence into what the UN does. The US has also continued its kind of attacks on Cuba. It's been doing an economic blockade of Cuba for months. But this week, Trump signed an executive order expanding sanctions on Cuba. So what it does is it expands the scope of existing sanctions to target agents, officials and material supporters of the Cuban government and anyone who is complicit in government corruption or serious human rights violations. It also curtails Cuba's access to the global banking system, imposing secondary sanctions on people, entities and any kind of financial institutions that conduct transactions with sanctioned people in Cuba. A couple of days later, almost a week later, Secretary of State Rubio unveiled a new sanction against Cuba, specifically targeting an enterprise called Grupo de Administración Empresarial, or GAISA, which is controlled by the Cuban military. And Rubio described it as the heart of Cuba's kleptocratic communist system. A nickel and mining company was also included in those sanctions. And this, to me, is actually really mirroring the kind of sanctions that the US put on Venezuela just in the weeks leading up to its attack on Venezuela and Maduro in January. Right, moving now on to nationalism. So firstly, ICE has been funded. The Senate Judiciary Committee and the Senate Homeland Security Committee have now released text to basically give ICE $72 billion via a reconciliation bill. And basically that means that it can pass the Senate without any Democrat votes. There's also increasing concerns about conditions in detentions. So a Cuban immigrant died in immigration custody in Georgia in what authorities say was a suicide. So meanwhile, ICE has awarded a contract to a private security company that has faced accusations of torture and enforced disappearance. And what that contract does is it asks that company to assist in tracking down undocumented immigrant children who've arrived in the US alone. And the US has now closed a watchdog office for federal immigration detention abuses. And the US does have really quite an explicitly racist refugee policy. So since October the 1st, of last year, the US has admitted just 4,499 refugees. So that's down from over 100,000 2 years ago. And all but 3 of those 4,499 come from South Africa and are white South Africans. Basically, Trump has described white South African farmers as victims of persecution. And the Trump administration is now basically saying they want to expand the access to the US refugee program, but only for white South Africans, by declaring an unforeseen emergency in South Africa, saying that that warrants this increase in refugee numbers. So now I just want to cover some actions that are really about undermining democracy and the rule of law. The first way the US has been undermining the rule of law is its continued attacks on alleged drug trafficking boats. So on the 4th of May, the US military said it had hit another drug trafficking boat in the Caribbean, killing 2 people on board. And then the very next day, the military said it had struck another boat in the Eastern Pacific Ocean, killing 3 people. So that brings the death toll to at least 190 people since September 2025. And this is part of the US's campaign against those it alleges are engaged in drug smuggling. But it hasn't ever really produced any evidence of this. And it's really not clear whether these kind of extrajudicial killings are legal. And in fact, they're probably not. Then, kind of looking at undermining the rule of law at home, a new analysis by the Associated Press shows that the Trump administration is increasingly ignoring the US courts. So the review found that district court judges ruled that the administration was violating an order in at least 31 lawsuits over a whole wide range of issues, and that furthermore there were 250 instances of non-compliance that judges have recently highlighted in individual immigration cases. And then in Fulton County, Georgia, they're trying to fend off a subpoena from a federal prosecutor who's trying to get contact information for thousands of poll workers who worked during the 2020 election. So that subpoena, issued in April, demands that Fulton County provide the rosters of election staff who served in that election, including their identification by name, position, residential and email address, and personal phone number. So this is a clear kind of intimidation tactic to future poll workers, and it's potentially a severe violation of privacy of the people who worked at the 2020 election. Talking about voting more generally, we are still in the midst of these kind of redistricting, gerrymandering battles. So the Supreme Court weakened the Voting Rights Act last week, which really opened up the possibility of more gerrymandering in southern states to redraw black majority districts, because they also happen to be Democrat voting majority districts. So firstly, Republican Governor Bill Lee called Tennessee lawmakers into a special legislative session to consider a plan that could break up the state's single Democratic-held US House district, which centres on the majority black city of Memphis. So that move comes after direct pressure from Trump to do this kind of redistricting. This measure was then passed, and 2 days later, Governor Lee signed it into law. In Alabama, Republican lawmakers have also advanced legislation to change congressional maps ahead of the midterms. So what Alabama did is it's asked the federal court to allow it to return to 2023 congressional maps that had been previously deemed to be an illegal racial gerrymander. So they're thinking now, actually, can we get away with this previously deemed illegal racial gerrymander given the Supreme Court ruling? Virginia voters, meanwhile, had supported in a referendum a couple of weeks ago a measure to redistrict Virginia to support Democrats and give Democrats more seats in the midterms. And that would have balanced out the additional seats that Florida's just got from its redistricting. But today, the Virginia Supreme Court overturned the Democrats' subsequent redistricting measure. So that now means that the Republicans have a clear lead in the gerrymandering efforts over the last year. And finally, I just want to highlight some kind of quite concerning actions that relate to science over the last week. So firstly, according to the Financial Times, the Pentagon has halted approvals for about 165 onshore wind projects on private lands, citing national security concerns. So the affected projects include wind farms that were awaiting final sign-off, others in the middle of negotiations, and some that would typically not have anything to do with the Pentagon. This is clearly in line with Trump's kind of anti-green energy agenda, but does seem kind of counterproductive as we're in the middle of a fossil fuel crunch from the Strait of Hormuz blockade. And then I'm going to move on to the Food and Drug Administration, so the FDA. So basically it emerged that the officials at the FDA have blocked the publication of several academic studies supporting the safety of widely used vaccines against either COVID-19 or shingles. And really, the withdrawal of these studies or the refusal to publish them is the latest attempt by the FDA and the Trump administration and RFK Jr. to basically limit people's access to vaccine, in this case by suppressing information about the safety of those vaccines. The very next day, the FDA allowed the marketing of fruit-flavoured e-cigarettes, and that's the first authorization for non-tobacco flavoured vaping products. And that again comes amid mounting political pressure on the agency to do that. So earlier on the same day, the Wall Street Journal had reported that Donald Trump had rebuked the FDA Commissioner Marty Makary over the weekend for not moving quickly enough to approve those flavoured vapes and nicotine products. And finally, The Guardian today reported how over the past year, the Trump administration has been altering and removing publicly available government data as part of a sweeping campaign targeting so-called woke programs, racial equity, gender ideology, and climate extremism. So that censorship is not just affecting data sets, but also a wide swathe of federal resources, the tools that help the public access data, ongoing surveys, and the agency staff that made it all possible. So that's all I'm going to cover today. All the actions are available on trumpactiontracker.info, and I will be back in a week or so.